Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Boyum, and I am the president and founder of the Defeating Epilepsy Foundation. We are a 501c3 located here in Southern California, and our mission is to provide the advocacy and educational resources to the epilepsy community in our society. Today, our guest is Ian Bone. Ian is the author of the book Sacred Lives, an account of history, cultural associations, and social impact of epilepsy. Ian has been a consulting neurologist for over 30 years now and has a son who is battling epilepsy. Thank you, Ian, for joining me today.
Thank you, Natalie.
To-
Delighted.
Thank you. Today's discussion, we are focusing on the stigma that is associated with epilepsy due to the lack of knowledge about what epilepsy is. As humans, we do not know or understand. We can easily fear. This can have a very negative effect on people who are battling epilepsy and in some situations put them at risk. The Defeating Epilepsy Foundation is working hard to carry out its mission to provide education and advocacy services. We fighting for the stigma associated with epilepsy to be removed. We must educate everyone on what epilepsy is. Ian, why do you feel there is such a lack of education about epilepsy despite how long it has been around?
I think to start with, one of the most difficult things is to inform and educate healthy people about health matters that they have no contact with or no knowledge of. I think that people become interested in learning about a condition when it either affects them personally, affects a close family member, or affects a close friend. And the majority of people out there are not in that situation. And therefore, they will maybe come into contact with epilepsy every once in a while. But it's difficult to incentivize them to learn about the condition. So their attitude to epilepsy is based upon, if you like, historical beliefs, misconceptions, mistruths, rumors. So they do not have a knowledge base, not through any fault of their own, but because of the fact that, as I say, for a healthy person with no knowledge of the condition, with no experience of it within the family, it's very difficult to think of them sitting down and learning about it. That's the difficulty. And that's why I think it is so difficult to educate the general public. We've got 50 million people in the world with epilepsy. It's a common condition, but we've got an awful lot more people who don't have epilepsy. And they, if you like, are the people that we need to teach and we need to educate. But it's a problem.
Oh, it certainly is. And I found in my work, I think one of the biggest challenges we've had, at least here in the States, is when we have the epilepsy organizations that have been put into place already, a lot of them are focusing on research and finding a cure, which is wonderful. But as far as services community or educating others outside the community, I think that's why it's one of the biggest problems we've had growing and getting support because, you know, the healthcare, besides the healthcare system, schools really don't understand what
No,
epilepsy is.
no.
Law enforcement really doesn't understand what epilepsy is. And until we address these things, how can we advocate and support others? I recently, through a program that I'm doing through the University of California at Riverside, I met a gentleman whose family immigrated here and his father his father was a genius. He patented a number of things and they have a very successful business, and he dedicates and donates a lot of money to the community I'm in right now, especially for career technical education, STEM programs, really working with a lot of kids. And when I mentioned my work and I mentioned the census data that I had found on the area, we have about 4.6 million people in the Inland Empire, and I told him there's about 46 to 47,000 people out here battling epilepsy. He sat in shock. He goes, I would have never thought there were close to 50,000 people in this community who had to deal with seizures. And I said
Mhm.
the reason for it is because of the fear. So many people refuse to acknowledge to others that they're dealing with this. And it's one of the reasons we are having such a hard time getting it accepted into society.
Absolutely right. And I think what you said earlier on about priorities, the World Health Organization launched a global campaign to bring epilepsy out of the shadows. And it asked healthcare professionals what their, if you like, what they wanted to see happening. And they asked people with epilepsy what they wanted to see happening. And the health professionals put equipment and new drugs at the top of the list.
Oh my
And the
goodness.
people with epilepsy said, well, stigma, social acceptability, employment, a normal life, that's what they put at the top of their list. So you had this situation where the people providing services to people with epilepsy had a different list of priorities from those with epilepsy. And the kind of power imbalance is that the providers perhaps have a greater say when they go and speak to legislators and healthcare providers on a national or state level. The providers have a greater say in terms of the agenda of what is necessary than the people with epilepsy do. And so
Yeah.
there is this imbalance. The World Health Organization targeted new drugs, development of new drugs, expansion of epilepsy surgery, development of EEG services, and improved access to imaging as their criteria. And the people with epilepsy, as I said employment, reduction of stigma, greater understanding of what is wrong with us.
And that's so sad. I mean, in a way, I'm glad to see that they do want to advance in better care and testing for proper diagnosis. We've come so far compared to when I was a child, 30 plus years ago. But at the same time, one thing I've done as an entrepreneur is trying to get people who work in business to understand how important it is to have some diversity in their profession, and that includes hiring people with disabilities, especially invisible illnesses like epilepsy. And so many, because they aren't educated about it, and I can understand their mindset, the first thing they think is liability. What if this
Mm,
worker of mine has a seizure on the job or gets hurt? They're worried
yes.
about getting sued. Or what if this person has a seizure in front of my clients? Are my
Mm,
clients going to come back, or are they going to be traumatized from seeing this? And I think if we could work on the education, like you said, rather than just focusing on treatment, but also removing the stigma, I think a lot of people failed to see that not only by not addressing this does it hurt people with epilepsy, but it hurts communities in our society. Because I pointed out to a number of entrepreneurs when we had a meeting, I said, there's 3.4 million people in America with epilepsy. 70% can work because their seizures are
mm,
controlled. But because they can't find gainful employment, they're discriminated against, they can't get proper treatment. They stress out, they have seizures, and eventually they give up and go on disability. Now remove that stigma and put them into the working field. Give them higher
yes.
education opportunities, help them learn a trade, help them build a business. Instead of them depending on you being isolated, now they're part of society and they're paying into society. It strengthens communities, it strengthens the economy, it helps, things for the better. And
Mm-hmm.
it pretty much took bringing numbers into it, where these people sat and went, I never thought of it, from that point of view. And I said, I
Yes.
understand that. I go, but it hurts all of us. I said, that's
Mm,
why change is so necessary for people, not just with epilepsy, but disabilities in general. I mean,
mm,
I belong to an organization. There's a nonprofit organization that helps disabled entrepreneurs. And I can't tell you how many people I've met with autism, or they're quadriplegics, or they have a learning disability, all sorts of different things. And they've been so stigmatized. All of them have said, I can't get disability, but I got to survive. So I realized if I'm not my own boss, I'm not going to make it.
Absolutely. I think that there's something slight in terms of the public's knowledge of epilepsy. This has improved. I mean, but you're starting from a very low base. Gallup, of the Gallup poll, carried out a survey in America over 30 years. Every 5 years, they did this survey from 1950 to, I think, the late 1970s. And when they started off, about 50% of people said someone with epilepsy shouldn't work. 50% said somebody with epilepsy shouldn't be playing with my children. 50% said somebody with epilepsy shouldn't get married. And if you then look over the 30-year period, that 50% negative drops down to about 10%.
Oh, wow.
So there has been an improvement. The public do have a greater understanding of epilepsy, but there is still a very significant amount of stigma out there. And of course, the trouble with all of these surveys, when you're asking people for your opinion on a condition, people always tend to veer on the side of saying positive rather than negative things. You know, if somebody comes up to you in the street with a questionnaire, you think, first of all, when they ask you the question, what should my answer be?
Yes.
What's the correct answer that I should be giving here? And that therefore influences all of these questionnaires, because you've got the response in the questionnaire, but you've then got the response in real life. You know, people who might be saying, yes, I would employ somebody with epilepsy, it would be no problem to me, when they're addressing a questionnaire, may have a completely different view when they're actually faced with somebody across an interview desk who they're interviewing for a job who has epilepsy.
Absolutely. And I think it's a lot of the reasons, including myself, why so many people hide it, even though now with the applications, one of my interns who has epilepsy says there's a box, you were talking about it in our last discussion, the box you have to check, and yes, you get an interview, but the chances of getting the job, you know, he even feels, he goes, I feel like I'm already judged before I sit down for
Yes,
the interview.
yes, yes, absolutely.
And I mean, myself, I hate to say it, I think I would be afraid to check that box, even though I know the risk of if somebody found out, I could easily get fired for not being honest on my application. But I think the stigma is so bad. I would honestly be scared to check it, thinking, is my, you know, are these people going to talk around if I try to apply for other jobs and go, oh, don't hire her, she has this condition. Am
Yes,
I putting
yes.
a black X on myself?
I think we mentioned before too, there's two types of stigma. There's perceived stigma, where we feel someone has discriminated against us as a consequence of an illness. And there's enacted stigma, where we know for a fact that somebody has discriminated against us. And the two are very difficult to separate. It's very difficult to be certain that you haven't got a job because of your epilepsy. But if you go around telling people, I can't get a job because of my epilepsy, people who don't have epilepsy will say, well, sounds a bit paranoid, that, you know, that sounds, you know, is that real? Is that genuine? Or is it just in their mind that their epilepsy is preventing them from getting employment? And I think that separation from enacted, real stigma and perceived stigma. And to give an example of that, and I think I've mentioned this before, there have been studies looking at people declaring their epilepsy when they enter a relationship. So do they declare it at the beginning? Do they declare it when they're getting engaged? Or do they never declare it? And for people to not declare their epilepsy is a form of perceived stigma, because their perception is, if I say I have epilepsy, this person will walk away from me. Now, if they say they have epilepsy and the person does walk away, that is enacted stigma, because it's actually happened. But if the perception of stigma stops you from declaring something, you never know whether you're actually going to be stigmatized against. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, no, it does. And probably in my own experience, I could see how it could be confusing, or in situations somebody might confuse it or might overlap in some ways. I had a situation where one of the community people in our area who helps get grants for companies, yeah, I could tell he didn't take a liking to my work and didn't feel it was really necessary. And in one way, I felt discriminated against. And then a friend of mine said to me, she goes, "No, take a step back." She goes, "Yeah, he was rude. Way he went about it wasn't nice." But she goes, "At the same time, it sounds like you're taking it a little personally." And she goes, "Don't take his negativity personally." She goes, "Just keep doing your work and prove him wrong." And it took having someone say something like, "Okay, maybe I shouldn't, allow it to eat me up so much." But I know a lot of what causes the bias is being discriminated against so many times in the past. The moment I feel something's headed that way, I become very defensive. I've just found
Yes.
over the years, you know, after a while, you've had enough. And that's
Mhm.
really what it comes down to. And that's what I've explained to people. They're like, "Why are you doing all this work?" And I said, "Well, 40 years experience of being discriminated against. I'm
I know,
done being
I know,
discriminated
I
against, and
know.
I don't want to see the next generation deal with what I've dealt with."
I know, I know, I know. There's a person I often refer to, Irving Goffman, who was a sociologist, who actually wrote the book about stigma. And he has a very nice way of dividing up mankind, if you like. He says that you've got the person with a condition who is the victim. You've got the world out there who don't have the condition, who are the normals. And then you've got the people who are related to, or who live, or who have experience of the condition, who he refers to as the wise normals.
Oh, I like that.
I think
This
it's a lovely distinction, because if you look at who we're trying to educate, we perhaps do need to educate the victim a little bit in terms of how to manage stigma. We need to do that. We don't need to educate the wise normal because they understand the problem. The people that we need to educate are the normals, and they're vast in number, and they're the people who inflict stigma on the victim. And that I find a very useful framework to think about stigma in terms of these three groups of people. I think it's a very useful framework.
It is. It's really interesting. And, I never thought of it that way before. It's awesome to learn something new from that kind of view, because I never thought of someone being a wise normal. But I
Yeah.
could see how that would play. It really would. And I try not to label people as normal because we all have our own faults and everything. But I've been guilty at times. I've had people say, "Well, if you had a wish, what would it be?" I said, "I would like to go one day in life without having to remind myself to take my medicine. I would like one
Mm,
day not to know what it's like to have to take a medication." And I go, "Just be normal one day." And they're like, "Well, why don't you feel normal?" And I said,
mm,
"It's not even so much a condition anymore." I said, "At times I feel imprisoned to my medication." I said, "That's really what it is. Like my medication has me on a leash. I know if I don't take it, I'm going to have problems. So if I want to appear as normal, I have to
yes.
go with the flow and comply with my treatment."
Yeah, absolutely. Goffman's book, it's very interesting because the title I like very much. And it's a very old book. I can't remember when it was published, but the title of the book is Stigma, Notes on a Spoiled Identity. And the concept being that your identity is spoiled by those who stigmatize against you.
No, I could see that very much, because the way we identify to others in society, I could see how a stigma could, any type of label, if it's not just medical, but how we identify as humans in so many ways. How if it doesn't meet the norm, it
Mm,
can be a spoiled identity. It could be a negative label. That's an
yeah.
interesting way to describe it. It really is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I have found that I'm not taken seriously as a professional by many due to epilepsy. I can understand why so many people hide why they have epilepsy. What do you think doctors and other medical professionals can do to help remove the fear of epilepsy when it comes to employment and careers?
It's a very difficult thing to answer that in a way, Natalie. I, because of my own personal experiences, always acted as an advocate. So when I had somebody who came to my clinic who was wanting to go to a training college to become a school teacher, I would write a letter for them. I would do those sort of things. Um, and that's a very individual way of trying to approach issues to try and support people who you see as patients, people who you care for. I think that attitude of being the advocate came very much out of my own personal experiences with Tim and with his epilepsy. And I always felt there was an obligation to fight the corner for people. I remember one man who was a lorry driver, and he didn't have epilepsy, actually. What had happened was that as a schoolboy at the age of 9, standing in the school cafeteria on a hot day with a tray of food, he fell on the ground because he fainted and took a few jerking movements. And he then became a lorry driver, driving all over the United Kingdom and Europe. And it went to his license being renewed, and he required a letter from his doctor to say that he'd never suffered from blackouts. And his doctor looked through the file and said, oh, yes, at the age of 9, he took a seizure.
Oh, no.
So this man then was in danger of losing his livelihood. And in a situation like that, I did the best that I could do in terms of writing to the driving authorities, doing everything that I could do to ensure that he got his license restored, which he did.
Oh,
And so
good.
I think there's a role there for doctors, but the truth is also that doctors are often very overworked in themselves, and it's not easy to pick up the cudgels on behalf of everybody that you see and fight their issue for them. And therefore, I think people need to use their epilepsy charities, their epilepsy societies, advocacy services to try and help them with issues that do arise. Um, what can the medical profession, the nursing profession do? I think social platforms are important. And one of the things that I've learned in the last few months really is just, I hadn't been on Twitter before, and I started using Twitter, and I found how many epilepsy people there were out there on Twitter giving advice on medication, giving sound advice, somebody putting, saying, I think I didn't take my medication this morning, what should I do? And
Yeah.
somebody coming on and giving them just a little bit of sound advice. And simple things like people putting on Twitter, I haven't had a seizure for a week, and some MD or epilepsy nurse putting, saying, well done, and
Yeah.
retweeting it. So I think there's a lot that can be done. I think social platforms really do offer an area where the professionals and the persons with epilepsy and the epilepsy charities and support organizations can come together. And it could be a platform where somebody might say, well, I went for an interview today at this particular company that work in this particular area of town, and I don't think that I was very well treated, and I think that I might have been discriminated against. And that's something that social media can push out and push forward. So I think that there is a lot that can be done. Yes, I do. I do.
Yeah. And I found that social media now has been such a tool we could take advantage of. I mean, myself, I remember being younger, feeling so isolated, but now that we have all these resources to connect on a global level,
Yes,
how
yes,
much
yes.
support we can give one another, and really how much we can learn from one another depending where we're living in the world, what kind of treatment do we have, what challenges do we face. I mean, it's one of the reasons I really enjoy working with Dr. Kasadi in Africa, because when I saw
Mhm.
the lack of education and how much discrimination they still face over there
I
in
know,
many
I know.
parts of Africa, it really has given me the ambition to just help and educate people and educate communities not to fear people with epilepsy And my goal is in time is to gather and educate enough people and gather enough information to say to the Minister of Health of these countries, look, there's no reason to fear it. You saw that HIV wasn't to be feared, and to help them with their their treatment, conditions like tuberculosis and what to do about that. It's the same thing with epilepsy. There's no reason to fear it. It's not contagious. They're not possessed. Just help them get their medicine and they'll be able to be productive in society.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there is so much that we can learn from the way that other conditions have gradually become integrated into what everybody accepts. And I think when you mention HIV, that's a perfect example, really. Um, I mean, I was involved in the very, very early days of the very first cases of AIDS. I remember it all very well. And I remember the stigmatization associated with people that would come into our wards with a neurological condition related to AIDS.
Oh,
And
wow.
that all has just evaporated now. And when you think back historically, you think of, as you correctly say, with TB, because TB was associated with poverty and squalor and poor housing, again, it was stigmatized against. And we even have conditions where the words have slipped into our language, leprosy, and somebody who is a social outcast, we call a leper. And
Oh,
and and,
wow.
and so, the way that illnesses and diseases through the years have been stigmatized, but have come out of the shadows, and yet epilepsy still hasn't. And I think we
Yeah.
have to learn from other conditions, mental health conditions. I mean, there was a time when anybody with a mental health disorder condition would not disclose that. But now we know so many people, famous people who've had, sort of bipolar disease, depression, and I don't think we any longer consider that to be a mark against them. In
Yeah.
fact, I think we often think of it as being a badge of courage that they have lived with these conditions and achieved what they have achieved. So we can learn so much from other conditions that have come out of the shadows. Regrettably, epilepsy still hasn't.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that the way we can come out in time is through a positive way. Both my sons have hemophilia, and they were very lucky they escaped where the HIV crisis was in the 80s and 90s, with my sons being a lot younger. They have tighter restrictions on the pharmaceutical companies now, where they can get the plasma to get the factor for the prophylactic treatment. But I mean, I remember as a child the stories of Ryan White. I'm friends with his mother, Jean, and she's still very involved in the community despite losing him 30 years ago. But so many that I met who have hemophilia now, but lost their uncles, their brothers, their fathers because of HIV, and the
Mm,
levels they had to go to say enough is enough. I mean, I think about 20,000 people have hemophilia in the US. And by the time they were done with the scandals over here of how they were collecting the plasma in prisons that they knew
mm,
had hepatitis C and HIV in it, but their attitude was, well, they're going to die anyways.
mm,
And it
mm,
was just so cold, and oh my goodness, just the thought
mm.
of when I've seen the documentaries on it,
Yes.
it killed over 10,000 people. It wiped out half the community back then.
Hmm. Hmm. I know. I know. Yeah. Well, we had exactly the same problems, not with HIV so much as with hepatitis in our hemophilia population. Yeah, we had exactly the same problems, and the kind of failure of people to accept this and to recognize it and to compensate when it had occurred. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it was very hard, and I find that sadly even now, despite they've made a lot of progress in the community, the younger generation, well, more my generation now, still feels the anger and pain of
Mm,
their father and their older siblings and others um, falling victims to this, and they feel that society still doesn't understand the
yes.
impact it had on their families, and rightfully
Mm,
so.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Well, when it comes to education, many people with epilepsy do not get the opportunity to seek higher education. Around 70% of people battling epilepsy can control their seizures. What do you feel we can do to help students with epilepsy be able to seek higher education?
I think we should do everything that is possible. I think one of the issues, and again, it's a historical issue, but that is, and again, I'm speaking from my own sort of experience, but when a diagnosis of epilepsy is made in the child, there is a perception, or certainly there was a perception amongst teachers, that maybe there was associated learning difficulties.
Mhm.
Now, we know that about 40% of people with epilepsy do have some degree of learning difficulty, but 60% don't. And I think often in the school, the failure of a child to achieve academically would be put down to the epilepsy rather than to something that needed specifically to be addressed in a professional teaching manner. So a label was attached.
Yeah.
And I think this explains why a lot of people, certainly I'm speaking in the United Kingdom, and again speaking a few years ago, why a lot of people in the United Kingdom found it difficult to progress on to university education because they were maybe regarded as people who weren't going to succeed in any case, and perhaps had less care and attention. That's maybe a terrible thing to say, but the knowledge that teachers have about epilepsy from the surveys that have been done is generally quite poor.
Yeah.
A teacher who has a child in the class with epilepsy is usually motivated to read about it. And there's now plenty of literature out there for teachers to come up to speed on what the issues that epilepsy might bring, what the drug treatments might do in terms of cognitive performance, what the drug treatments might do in terms of any visual symptoms like double vision or what have you. So I think teachers now are probably better informed. I'm sure they are. And I suspect that as a consequence of that, more and more people are going on to what we would call tertiary or secondary, tertiary education.
Yeah.
The issue then is an issue of going to college or going to university. What do the people there understand about epilepsy if they have a young adult who is now a student? And again, I think things have improved a lot. In the United Kingdom, most universities now have a student health department. And most people that come to university from their family doctor will have a report from their family doctor on what medication they're on and what health issues they might have. So I think our universities now do cope far better with people who are living away from home with a long-term condition that needs some degree of supervision. So I think, again, things have improved. I think they have.
I think they have to a degree too. I know here in the United States with us having FAPE, which is free access to public education, and the IDEA Act, which ties in with individual education plans, and that's to make sure that children with disabilities have an individualized plan for it could be a learning or physical disability or hidden illness like epilepsy. They will structure the plan to make sure that the student does as well as they can do and gets the services we need. The challenge I have found over here is really because the IDEA Act doesn't carry over to the colleges, and it's more of the college policy, even though the ADA protects to a degree. They really, some schools get it, but some schools don't. I have found it
Mm.
comes down to the disability director. A lot of them, because they don't understand what epilepsy is, may perceive that, oh, they're really not college material and shouldn't be here, which I
Yeah.
find is very wrong because I mean, myself, I've been lucky. I've always been very smart, but I do have challenges. It takes me a little longer to learn things, or I have to, it's easier for me to watch a video than it is try to read it. I could read something, understand it, but until I read it 2, 3 times, it's not going to stick in my brain. I could easily look it over and you could say, well, tell me what'd you just read, and I might be able to tell you a fraction of it, not because I didn't read it, but the way my brain takes things in because of my brain injury. And I think a lot of them, because they don't understand the complexity that epilepsy can bring, they really don't have confidence in the students, which I think is, to me, it's wrong, because
Yes.
you're depriving a lot of students who could do so much by having that label on them. And where you were talking about the system in Scotland, it sounds a lot like what my husband Tobias grew up with in Bavaria. They had a program where you went to primary school, and I think it was by 5th grade, when they were around 10, depending how well they did, the teachers decided if you were going to a secondary school to learn a
That's right.
trade or gymnasium. And if you had any problems and you went to the secondary program, it was very hard to get off that track to gymnasium. My brother-in-law is very smart, but it was the same for him. He learns things in a different way. So my in-laws actually had to send him to a boarding school where it was smaller and he got more attention before they finally could send him to gymnasium. They pretty much had to go around the system to, and luckily they had the money to do it, but they had to go around the system to get him on that track.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think also you mentioned the subtleties. And when you think of certainly with temporal lobe epilepsy, you might have people who, depending upon where their seizure originates, may have some verbal memory issues or visual memory issues. And these can be very subtle. And again, these may impact, certainly going on to higher education, they may impact upon performance. And I think it's a need to kind of understand that and accommodate that. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Because what I did, I didn't because of my experience in my undergrad, when I did my master's degree, I decided not to go through disability services. But what I did, if there was something I didn't understand with reading it, I would go onto YouTube and type the subject in and find a lecture. There's tons of stuff on YouTube. And I would learn that way. I would try to find
Right.
another resource so that I could retain the material and do what I needed to get through the class. So luckily
Yeah.
we have those tools now, where years ago it probably, I don't want to say I wouldn't have been able to do my master's, but it would have been much more challenging probably for me compared to what it was.
Absolutely. And again, I can sort of, from personal experience, turning the clock back many, many, many years, in our own family experience, when Tim was at university, one lecturer commented that maybe somebody with epilepsy shouldn't be at university. But we've moved on so much from that kind of mindset. Thank goodness we have. And so, again, I think for higher education, I think things are much more positive than they were. Much more positive. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, despite the number of nonprofits focused on epilepsy, we have still struggled to get information out to society about epilepsy. We need to do more than just educate those
Mm.
battling with epilepsy. We need to bring it to the attention of the public. What are your views on this?
I mean, I felt for a long time, and again, using the parallels of HIV, using the parallels of the gay movement, using parallels of mental health conditions. What has brought things into the light have been role models. It's been people who stepped forward. If you take gay rights, I mean, in the 1950s, one of our great heroes in the United Kingdom was a scientist in the war who managed to crack the Enigma code and apparently saved millions of lives by doing, hundreds of thousands of lives by doing this. And his name was Alan Turing. And Alan Turing was then found at the end of the war to be gay. And he was prosecuted and he was castrated.
Oh my goodness.
Chemically castrated. Now, Alan Turing is now on the back of our banknotes as a national hero. He's now accepted by society for what he was, a brilliant man who did brilliant work. He's no longer castigated by society for being somebody who was not normal in society's concept of what normal is. So if you can do that over a space of time, if you can turn somebody into a national hero by recognizing that what they had is not something terrible, not something wrong, then that same thing can be, that same mindset can be applied to illness. And so if you then move forward from that acceptance of gay rights, the total acceptance by society, no one nowadays, I believe, would be stigmatized. Certainly not within the circle I move in. I don't think that would happen. If you move forward from that to what we mentioned earlier on, HIV, and we now know of famous people, actors, musicians who are HIV positive, and we don't think of them in a negative way. And we look at people again in the public eye, as I mentioned earlier, bipolar and depressive illness, and we don't feel any less of them. Now, why have these things moved forward and epilepsy has lagged behind? Because we don't have the role models. We don't have people coming out into the open and saying, I have epilepsy, I'm star in all of these films, or I play music at all of these concerts. And we need that. We desperately need the role models. And again, it comes back to what we're talking about in terms of the social platforms. You can see how people can become influencers, how they can change public perception through being famous and having a view. And yet for epilepsy, we don't have these people. We desperately need them. And they're there. We know they're out there. Of course they're there. I mean, we know in terms of how common a condition epilepsy is, that they're out there. I know of one of your senators who I can't remember his name now, a senator or a congressman who's been very vociferously supported epilepsy throughout his
Oh,
career.
Tony Calijo. He was a
Yes,
representative out here in California. In fact,
yes,
he still does work. He's working right now. A dear friend of his is actually one of my mentors in the program I've been through
right.
DR. And what Tony is doing now is he's trying to add into the Americans with Disabilities Act for people who are visually impaired, who have a difficulty using digital platforms, to be able to get these companies to make it where it's accessible for people, because
Mm,
of us depending so much on the internet now, and our lives changing because of the internet and mobile access. He feels they have not stepped up to the plate and considered people with disabilities with the changes they're making. So he's still busy working away. I'm hoping in time to meet him. My mentor has reached out to him about my work,
good,
and I'm hoping
good.
to connect. But the frustration I've had with the politicians, I'm trying to connect to my local politicians right now, because we still haven't put a seizure safe school law in place here in California, but they have in other states. And unless it's something that really grabs their attention, they're not addressing it. But I've already called a few times, and I won't stop calling until I get their attention.
Right.
I've been very lucky. One of the alumni from my university, he's a lobbyist for the teachers union in Sacramento. And when him and I talked about it, he told me flat out why they wouldn't help pass it at this point. And he said it's because of the lobbyists, other people pressuring them to get teachers to train to administer rescue meds, which I think is not fair to teachers because they're not medical professionals. And I
Mhm.
feel that a nurse should be on, a lot of times there isn't a nurse on campus for these kids. They might have
Right,
a
right.
CNA or a mom volunteers, or someone has some basic training. But I feel if we have children with life-threatening chronic illnesses on campus going to school, we need to at least have some level, like a licensed vocational nurse, somebody who understands the basics of it. And if they have to take action, they can. I mean, myself as a mother with two kids with chronic illness, if something happened to my boys and they administered prophylactic treatment or something to my kids without my consent and it killed
Mm,
them, I won't
mm,
lie, I would retain an attorney. You could put all the liability waivers you want into that paperwork. I'm still going to advocate for my child.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. It's getting, I mean, the person, Tony, you mentioned, and I've heard of him here in the United Kingdom. I know of him, but we don't have really anybody here. We have no leading politician here standing up and saying, I have epilepsy. We have within our parliament, we have what's called the Cross-Party Committee on Epilepsy. We have about 20 members of parliament who sit in a parliamentary group who hear about issues relating to epilepsy. But we don't have anybody, as I say, any prominent person standing up and declaring their condition. Until somebody does that, I think epilepsy will always remain in the shadows.
Yeah, sadly.
It's come out a long way, but it's still in the shadows. And we do need a Kardashian or something like that. You know, somebody with that kind of profile and that kind of following and the platform to educate. We need someone like that. Yes.
Oh, we do, because I mean, myself, despite the level I have worked at on a global level to educate others, I've told a lot of people over here battling epilepsy. I mean, they'll send me all sorts of, I can't say no one's backing me up. I mean, they sent all sorts of support and love and everything. But I've told so many, until we get together and work as a team, I'm only one person. I can't save everybody. I can't save the world. And years ago when Trump first got into power, they were trying to remove the Affordable Care Act protections that were put in place, and that would have really, it would have killed a lot of people. And I wrote
Yes.
all 100 senators saying you can't let this happen. You're asking for trouble if you let this happen. And when I went down to Washington and was trying to work with the Epilepsy Foundation to fight more for this, I took all 100 letters and a personal letter to Phil Gattone and met with him at the walk that year. They were all like, "Oh, go get him, girl." And I'm like, I'm one person. If I went to the Capitol and started yelling about how we need protections, not one politician is going to stop and listen to me. In fact, they're going to go to the Capitol Police and say, "Would you please tell her to get off the property or arrest her for trespassing? Do something to get rid of her, would you please?" I said, "Now, if we all get together," I said, "even let's say just a third of us," I go, "that's a million people right there. What are the politicians going to say if you got a million people on the steps demanding better health care,
Yes.
demanding better treatment, better education, employment opportunities? Now we have a system together. Now we have a force. Now we have a voice. One person themselves don't have a voice."
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the stigma and fear that is associated with epilepsy is a global problem. Working with professionals in Africa, many have told me about people thinking it is contagious, that people are possessed. We must get past this medieval mentality and help those battling epilepsy. What do you think larger organizations can do to help those in Africa?
I think it's very difficult because the whole history of stigma in epilepsy goes back over a few thousand years. I mean, if you go back to the earliest medical texts, the Babylonian texts, around about 2000 BC, epilepsy there is perceived as a condition of demonic possession. And you start from there and you see religions and societies throughout the world as they adapt and change. Perhaps that concept of demonic possession was lost in the Western world, maybe towards the end of the 19th century. It disappeared. And so surveys that have been done, asking school children, asking adults what they think the cause of epilepsy is. In the Western world, contagion, demonic possession are in the kind of, 1 to 2% of responders believe this. It's very much in the minority. If you then look at studies that have been done in Africa, you find the reverse. You find that demonic possession is still perceived by about 40% as being a factor, and contagion again by about 40 to 50%. So somehow you've got to get the message across that this is no longer what is perceived
Yeah.
in the rest of the world. How do you do that? Because you're dealing with different religions, you're dealing with different beliefs, you're dealing with countries where sometimes it's not the health professional who's at the front of providing healthcare, but it's the village healer. And the village healer often comes from a spiritual or religious background. So you've got enormous cultural issues. I think you have to accept that the countries in Africa have different perceptions, and we have to understand how those perceptions have come about. We mustn't be, what's the word, dismissive of them or ridicule them as being silly. We have to understand why they're there, and we have to work at how we try and remove them. And it is not an easy thing to do. And I admire the work being done in the Democratic Republic. I know what's going on there, and I admire that work. And they need many, many programs like that. And they need to go back to the World Health Organization and their global plan for epilepsy. They need to be looking at how they will provide funding to develop programs to move things forward.
Oh, absolutely, they do. I mean, I was reading not too long ago on Al Jazeera how involved World Health Organization is down there, especially since COVID. Dr. Casati, when we first met, he reached out to me, and it wasn't even because of so much his patients having seizures. It was his patients were starving to death in the rural areas, and they couldn't get access to food up there. And the World Health Organization pretty much went in there and did a lot of work to get access to food in the areas, because if they hadn't, it would have been so much worse than what it had been. They pretty much said it would have been beyond a food crisis. It would have been a destruction to many communities. And I think a
Yes.
lot of people really don't know how much poverty, especially in areas that sadly over the years have been torn apart by war, how much it still plays an effect. I don't know, I can't remember the name of the documentary. It's not based about Africa, but when the war in Afghanistan broke out, there was a gynecologist who he was from there, and he trained in the US, and he went back during the war to take care of patients, take care of women, to make sure they had safe childbirth. And one of the patients, it was really heartbreaking. She had a seizure, and the mother called the priest, and he thought a demon was inside of her and beat her to death with a cane. And when the mother took her to the doctor was so angry with the mother, and I understood why. He's like, why didn't you bring me to her in the first place? And it was just because of lack of education. They became so
Yes.
frightened, they didn't know what to do and thought they were doing the right thing, calling the priest to the house, and didn't realize that, sadly, the priest killed her.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think alongside the World Health Organization, you've got the International Bureau for Epilepsy, you've got the International League Against Epilepsy. And I think all of these organizations are fully aware of what the problem is. It's the
Yes.
solution of the problem and the length of time it will take to solve it. And again, it comes to education as being the key to it all. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm doing the work I am with Dr. Casati, and I'm hoping in times when we have the results to show. What I'm really happy is the Epilepsy Alliance of Africa professor, I hope I'm saying his last name right, Kissimi, down in Morocco. Are you familiar with
I
him?
don't know. No, I don't know.
No.
No.
He's a very, very nice man, and he's working to advocate telemedicine services for people in epilepsy throughout Africa to give them better access to care. And he's really happy about this. And he's hoping in times as we strengthen this and more people get educated to implement it in other parts of Africa, which really we find it is so needed. And I'm hoping with the success we have, it's not going to take time. I gave a presentation in March, and I told them, just the first couple of years we're going to be doing nothing but teaching down to the DRC.
Yes. Yes.
This is going to be a project where in time we might not see the true effects that we want to see till I'm much older. But I hope
Mhm.
to see them before leaving this earth and seeing them being able to be implemented in other parts of the world that need
Absolutely.
it.
I think one of the issues with teaching programs is looking at outcomes and the sustainability of outcomes. That to me has always been a problem. That a teaching program, I think, to be effective, has to be a teaching program that continues to repeat itself.
Yes.
If you put in a teaching program for a short period of time, look at your outcome measures and find improvement, but then go back 2 or 3 years later and remeasure the benefit of the program, as time goes by, it gets lost. So there is such a need for it to be a continuous process. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I'm hoping we can do that by gathering enough information to show the Minister of Health that if we want to continue this positive road and help people become part of society instead of being hidden from society, that it's going to be a team effort. I can't expect, I mean, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they have 600,000 patients and 8
Mm,
neurologists. I
mm,
can't expect 1 out of 8 neurologists to take on the whole country by himself. And
no.
sadly, that's pretty much what's happening right now. It,
Mhm, mhm.
and I'm hoping to bring others on when they see the benefits of everything. But I think really for it to succeed, and I hope we can convince them, is bringing the Minister of Health and getting them
I
involved in
know.
it and pushing to really make this change.
Mm. I think we don't appreciate, and you've put your finger on it, the kind of numbers involved. I, just before I retired, trained a neurologist who went back to the southern Sudan as the only neurologist in the southern Sudan.
Wow.
And it just makes you think, well, how on earth, for him, he was very good. For him to affect change would be such a mountain to climb, really, as a single-handed person dealing with millions.
Yes. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize in the Western culture. I mean, I think out here, I might have the choice of 4 or 5 neurologists in my medical group. And at one point, there was, unfortunately, the epileptologist I wanted to see. He switched groups right as I was coming into it. But
Mm.
I mean, at least I could say I have a choice. If I'm not happy with
Yes,
someone,
yes,
I can
yes.
say, okay, I want a second opinion. When you
Mm.
have that situation where you might have one neurologist and one neurosurgeon in the country, you have no choice.
No,
It's like
no.
work with them or die. And that is
Mm.
such a stressful situation, not just even on the patient, but I'm sure I can't imagine as a doctor having to be the one and only who is trying to keep some level of normalcy, some level of stability in the country for these patients.
I know, I know, I know.
I mean, it almost, I don't want to say, well, it is impossible. I hate to say it that way. I hate to sound so negative, but it is impossible because even as doctors, at the end of the day, you're human. And
Mhm,
I mean, the one
mhm,
thing I've been lucky about working with you and working with others since I've started my work, one of the doctors that she's a primary doctor, and we talked, and I told her about my frustrations with relationship with doctors, and she said, well, it's 2 things. One, she goes, when it comes to specialization, a lot of neurologists, people think, okay, they just study the brain. She goes, you may have someone who specializes in spinal problems. You might have someone
mhm,
who specializes in Parkinson's or specializes in stroke. She said they're not going to have the courage to say to you, I really don't know.
mhm, mhm,
That's one
mhm.
thing. She goes, they fear saying the words, I don't know. And she
Yes,
goes,
yes.
and another thing is because of the way the American healthcare system is, she goes, you're constantly on a stopwatch. You have so many minutes to talk to the patient, so many minutes to make a decision, many minutes to get that treatment. And she goes, and then you run to the next patient. And she goes, after
Mhm,
a while of doing that day after day, year after year, she goes, doctors burn out. She goes,
mm,
doctor burnout is very common, even though they
mhm,
won't discuss it. And a lot of doctors end up depressed because they have
mhm,
burnout. And she
mhm,
goes, and that's when you see doctors sadly detach from their patients, and it goes from a passion to a paycheck. And she
mhm,
goes, and a
mhm.
lot of them, they're trying not to be like that with their patients, but people don't see us as human as well. We're okay, we're educated, snap the fingers, we're supposed to have an answer. And she goes, it doesn't really work that way.
Mhm, mhm. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And one of the interesting things is you mentioned mental health in doctors. Doctors are people who very rarely declare mental health problems.
Yeah.
They self-stigmatize because they think somehow it's a sign of weakness to declare you have a mental health problem because you're not coping. And that there is a lot of mental health in the medical profession. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, what do you feel we can do in general as a global society to help remove the fear associated with epilepsy so that we can reduce and in time remove the stigma associated with epilepsy?
I think we have to make knowledge, if you like, of epilepsy much more available. We know that about maybe 50% of people see a seizure at some time during their life. We know that it can be a very frightening experience if you've never seen it before. We've got enormous opportunity for the media with film, with television, to portray epilepsy in a way that it doesn't become a frightening thing to see. There aren't that many films that show seizures. And there are quite a few television programs. You may have come across a lady, Toba Kersen, who's a sociologist in Philadelphia, who's done a lot of work on the way that epilepsy is portrayed on television. For instance, is it House is a program in America? Isn't it a medical program, House? And there's,
Yes.
is it Chicago something as well? Grey's Anatomy. Grey's
Grey's
Anatomy.
Anatomy, yeah.
Well, what she'd done was she'd actually looked at seizures that were depicted in Grey's Anatomy, and somebody else had actually published a paper on seizures depicted in American television programs. And the first aid, first of all, is very bad. That the doctors on Grey's Anatomy or I can't remember the other one, the other big ER on ER,
Yeah.
the doctors seeing people coming into the ER with seizures, often their actual first aid management was not appropriate. So the opportunity to teach the public how to deal with a seizure if it takes place in the street was lost.
Oh, wow.
So I think television, I think film have a great opportunity to educate the public in the first aid of seizures, to make them aware of what seizures look like, and to maybe make them understand that they are not things to be feared.
Yes.
So I think that's one area. I think, again, to get back to what I keep on going on about, of people in the public eye coming forward with their seizures and letting people know about them, and letting them know that it's possible to live an entirely normal, fulfilled, successful life and still have epilepsy.
Oh,
So I think
absolutely.
these are the important things I think to advance, to try and make the public understand the condition more than they do. And as I said right at the very beginning, it's difficult to educate the normals in a condition that they don't have and have no knowledge of. Why should they sit down and listen to a lecture about epilepsy? But if they see epilepsy on the television, if they see it in the movies, if they see famous people with it, then maybe their perception will change.
I hope so. I think the only thing, and I'm glad you said it, is when it comes to film and production, they don't show it as what it really is. And
No.
sadly, because of it, a lot of people mock and make fun of it. Netflix got into trouble a couple times because they were having situations where they were making fun of it than anything, and it led to on TikTok they were doing a seizure challenge when people were faking seizures and laughing about it. And sadly, I found it very distasteful. I think TikTok took a number of them down. They got, thank goodness, that's one thing I'm very happy with the Epilepsy Foundation here. When things like that are happening, the advocacy attorneys and the president are, especially when Phil Gattone was there, would not tolerate it and
Good,
got
good,
on them and would write public letters that, and not just to
good.
them, but publish them to let people see that they were not going to tolerate this being accepted. And I know Netflix finally backed off, and TikTok has removed a lot of it. I know they've had
Good.
problems with people still trying to do it, and sadly, it's not just autism or epilepsy they're making fun of, but autism and other things. Sadly, so it really is arrogance due to lack of education that a lot of
Mhm.
these people are doing these things. And I just look at it and I feel like if I would ever have a conversation with these people, it would be one, I hope you never experience a seizure. Myself being having epilepsy, even I mean, you could be my worst enemy. I still would never wish a seizure on you.
Mm,
So
mm,
to see
mm.
people faking it,
I
I'm
know.
just
I
to
know.
me, it's no joke.
The cinema over the years, and again, there have been people who've reviewed films in great detail, but as a kind of brief summary of it, if a man in a film has epilepsy, he's usually the villain of the film.
Oh wow.
If a woman in a film has epilepsy, she's usually a vulnerable person who needs help and support. And it's interesting because that's the same in literature as well. Charles Dickens, several of his novels have people with epilepsy in them, and they're usually the bad guys. And so the idea of maybe making somebody in your film a hero who has epilepsy would carry a lot of weight and would be very, very beneficial.
I
It
think
would.
so too. I really do because I look at how people portray me, and a lot of people think of me as vulnerable. And I admit that's when I get very defensive,
Mm,
especially in the line of my work, when people think, oh, how can you handle something like this? And I'm thinking, I've been handling it for many, many years, and so have many others. It's life. You know what you have to face in order to survive, and you just do it. And if you don't do it, you're going to sadly face the consequences for it.
mhm.
So you really don't have time. I can't say I'm never vulnerable. It's human to be vulnerable, but you can't allow yourself to be weak. You have to
Mhm.
set realistic goals for yourself,
Yeah.
or you're not going to survive in this society because, I can't speak for what goes on in other parts of the world, but living here in America, it's sadly a very dog eat dog mentality. You have to work, you have to do what you need to do, because if you don't, you're not going to have a very nice life here. It can be a
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
difficult, very stressful life, and it's a lot of the reasons we have here in the US, the levels of obesity we have, the
Mhm.
heart
Mhm.
trouble, cancer, all these things, because it ties back to the culture and environment we have here. It's due
Yes.
to, sadly, the levels of corruption and more of the, I hate to say it, people higher up thinking it's all about them and forgetting
Mhm.
who they're supposed to really be serving.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Again, I want to thank Ian for coming and taking part. To see the great work we are doing, please like our social media page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You are welcome to visit our website at www.defeatingepilepsy.org to see how we are making a difference for the epilepsy community. Thank you for your support, and together we will defeat epilepsy. Take care.